Yeah.
Sitting there on the grass down there.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Rick Sarre from the University of South Australia. My pleasure to welcome you here to this first session on the last day of Writers' Week. It's been a wonderful week, and this is looking very popular this morning. It's going to be a very interesting topic, I'm sure. Just by way of tent keeping, a few things you've heard a lot this week, but yes, mobile phones to silent. If you are tweeting, the hashtag is #ADLWW, so keep those instas and hashes coming. I also want to mention and remind you the book signing will take place straight afterwards at the book signing over there. Most importantly this morning, we are live streaming to the regions. So hello and welcome to all those people who are in libraries around this fair state of ours, which is marvellous. A quick shout out to my Auntie Margaret at the Stirling Library. She'll be impressed amongst her peers, I can assure you. And I understand we'll be having questions from them as well. So during the question time, and I'm going to have a lot of time for questions today, I'm planning on about 20 minutes because there'll be questions, I'm sure, coming in from the regions. Two important preliminary announcements and acknowledgements, which we do at each session, and particularly when we start at 9:30 in the morning. We acknowledge this garden. The Pioneer Women's Memorial Garden was built in the late 1930s to celebrate the achievements of pioneer women for the first 100 years of Australian European history. It stands now as a symbol for women of all ages and nationalities, many of whom have overcome isolation and loss to establish their families and thriving communities in our state. We thank the trustees for their support of this event and acknowledge and thank the Government of South Australia through Arts South Australia, Heritage SA and the City of Adelaide Council also for their very generous support. Let's give them a hand this morning. And as we begin, we also importantly acknowledge country. We know that these gardens here are built on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, who have been the custodians of these lands for the last 60,000 years. And just think about that for a second. That's 2,000 to 3,000 generations of people who would have sat here on the banks of the Torrens, sharing stories and learning from each other. So I think it's an entirely appropriate thing that we're doing this morning, sharing stories and learning from each other here on Kaurna land. And we continue appropriately to acknowledge their spiritual connection with these lands. It's time for me to make some introductions to our important guests this morning. Let me start with Louise Milligan, fast becoming a household name. Her powerful approach to the Four Corners program that most of us would have seen recently on the ABC regarding St Kevin's College in Toorak is now somewhat legendary in most people's memories. Her story for the ABC 7:30 program on allegations regarding George Pell won her 2 Quill Awards from the Melbourne Press Club. For this book, Cardinal, The Rise and Fall of George Pell, first published in 2017 and now updated, she was awarded the Walkley Book Award. Please welcome Louise Milligan. On the other side of Louise is David Marr, who normally would be asking the questions, so he's going to be feeling a little uncomfortable the other side as I give him some questions today.
David's never uncomfortable.
David...
Bullshit.
As we all know and love David for his contribution every year to Writers' Week, he's one of Australia's most celebrated journalists, a lawyer by training. David has written for many of our best mastheads and notably many years ago presented the ABC's Media Watch. Among his many books is The Prince, Faith, Abuse and George Pell, first published as a quarterly essay in 2013. This title has now been revised and is also the topic of today's conversation. Please welcome David Marr. Now, we're going to mix and match this morning. A lot of questions I'll direct to one, but I'm sure the other may have something to say about that. I've got a bit of a structure here we're going to follow, but I've got a feeling it's going to be somewhat free-flowing, particularly with Mr. Marr on the other side over here. But let me start with you, Louise. You were born in Ireland. You're now a journalist in Australia. What's the journey between those two statements for you?
Well, in relation to this subject matter, I was born into a family on my mother's Irish side of very strong Catholics. Mum had 10 brothers and sisters, as I like to say, the full Irish Catholic catastrophe. And my father grew up in Scotland, and he actually converted to Catholicism when he was a teenager, when he went to Ireland, and that's where he met Mum, and he fell in love with it. Now, interestingly, he's still a very devout Catholic. My mum has had enough of it, but I devoted this book to my dad because he's one of those who wants this institution to be better. He wants to ride through this crisis and to reckon with its past. And he actually, fact-checked a bit of the Catholic stuff in my book because I had probably suppressed the memory of a lot of it. I had left the church when I was, in my teens. But when this issue sort of came into the public domain, I was still at school, really, but of course when the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse was sitting, I was a journalist at the ABC TV 7:30 program, and it was obviously an issue which was of an intense concern to me, an interest to me, because, I'm sure every ex-Catholic or current Catholic here will say, it's in your bones. You can't quite put it away. And I felt that, there were really interesting things to sort of be explored, and that a generation of children had been let down. And, I've spent the past few years of my life working to give those children a voice.
David, Louise has mentioned something about the Royal Commission I'll give it its full name, into Institutional Responses to Child Abuse. Can you remind us again why it happened, why it was resisted, and why it eventually went ahead?
Absolutely key to this story is the arrival on the scene in Australia of well-trained, secular police men and women. In the old days, it was understood that the Catholics in the force, the Catholic cops, would look after the problems of the Catholic Church. And that was understood by politicians too. And everything was kept quiet. But in the 1980s, there began to reach appropriate levels in the police force men and women who did not believe in that arrangement. And they began to pursue allegations of child abuse by priests and clerics. Not just priests of the Catholic Church, of course, but clerics and teachers. And this was at a time when there was a kind of rolling thunder coming from the United States, where some very brave parents, beginning actually in Louisiana in the early 1980s, began to sue the church, and sue the church for enormous sums of money for the abuse of their children. Now, the corporate structure of the church in America and the corporate structure of the church in Australia are very, very different. And in America, unlike Australia, you could win huge damages in court. These things were rolling around the world at a time when Ireland very bravely set in place some inquiries, not a national inquiry, which we were heading towards, but diocese by diocese inquiries. And the most dramatic of these was an inquiry that took many years into the diocese of Cloyne. Now, Cloyne is Cork, isn't it, Louise? It's a Southern Irish. And this report came out. It was devastating report into the Catholic Church. And what happened then reverberated around the world. The then Irish Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, got up in the Dáil in Parliament and delivered what's now a very famous statement. The Cloyne report excavates the dysfunction, disconnection, elitism, the narcissism that dominated the culture of the Vatican to this day, the rape and torture of children were downplayed or managed to uphold instead the primacy of the institution, its power, its standing and its reputation. That was in 2011. That was a cannon blast around the world, and particularly in Australia, because the church in Australia is to such a great extent an Irish church. And always, as these developments occurred, there was Pell and there were other church leaders saying, nothing to see here, nothing to see here, we don't need a royal commission, we don't need a commission into this, backed resolutely by political leaders, by John Howard in particular, saying, no, we don't need a royal commission. When our Governor-General had to resign because of his inept handling of abusive priests in the Anglican Church, the Anglican Church called for a royal commission. And still the politicians said, no, 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 no. And then the police emerged in Victoria and in Newcastle in New South Wales to give statements, public statements, saying the church is actually interfering with our investigations into child abuse by priests. And that was the last match that set the bonfire alight. To the very end, Pell was opposing. He made a magnificent statement saying the only reason he could see for a royal commission would be corruption or mismanagement on a large scale in the church. He didn't say children. He didn't say children. He said corruption and mismanagement.
Which there was, by the way.
Which there also was. And then in the most significant act of our Prime Minister's short career, she called a royal commission.
And it's significant that our first woman Prime Minister, our only woman Prime Minister, was the one who finally had the guts to stand up to these people and do it.
Yeah.
Louise, another question historically then, but prior to the Royal Commission, there had been a number of inquiries within the church that were talking about compensation, talking about getting to the bottom of this problem, dealing with it towards healing, the Melbourne response, etc., talking about paying compensation, but it all went awry. What happened there? What's the general feeling about why that history, going back some 15 years, went awry?
Well, towards healing and the Melbourne response was set up by Pell just before Towards Healing, which was the national response that the church had been talking about for quite some time to this crisis in the 1990s. Just before they were about to announce it, Pell stepped in with his own scheme. And significantly, under his scheme, the cap for compensation was lower. It was a much less generous scheme. And I have to say, of all of the people that I have spoken to, survivors of child sexual abuse and their families who have gone through the Melbourne response, I mean, Pell always puts it forward as, well, I was the first person who,
On earth.
Yes, on earth, who marched in and, did something about this crisis. I am yet to meet a single person who not only felt that it was inadequate, but felt that it actually actively re-traumatised them, that it made it worse. And, you had examples like, you would get $25,000 in compensation for a lifetime of pain, but the lawyers would tell you that if you were to sue the church, then the church, we will accept your abuse if you take this $25,000
and shut up about it for life.
And sign a deed of release. But if you sue us, then the claim will be vigorously denied. So the same abuse didn't exist if you're suing us for, $750,000 or $1 million, but we'll let it happen for 25. And that's what happened in the case of the Fosters. Chrissy and Anthony Foster, who I'm sure everyone would know about, whose two daughters were tragically, terribly abused by a shocking priest in Melbourne. One of them is now dead and the other one is permanently disabled.
Just gossip, said Pell, just gossip.
Yes, and Chrissy's husband Anthony famously described Pell when they went to see him, they showed him a picture of their daughter, who was still alive at this point, who'd made a suicide attempt, and she had cuts on her wrists. And when he looked at the picture, he said, "Oh, she's changed." And Anthony said that he was sociopathically in denial.
Louise, we're talking about George Pell. A lot of your book is about George Pell, the young man, George Pell, the priest, in Ballarat and other places. He was called Big George. Tell us something about him as a man growing up.
Well, Big George is actually the name that he was given by a complainant, famously in the Southwell inquiry, which we might come to a bit later. But yeah, George Pell was, growing up, quite an extraordinary young student at St Patrick's College in Ballarat, which was kind of known as a priest factory. He was, top of the class. He gave the Purton Oratory, which was a very distinguished speaking prize, 2 years in a row. He was on all of the sort of sporting teams. He was selected for Richmond in what was then the VFL.
To train for Richmond.
Yes. He was...
He didn't get a game, in other words, I'm just saying, David.
He didn't run on.
He didn't, but he was, he was in rowing, he was in athletics, he was...
Head of everything.
Head of everything. He was in cadets. He was very much into discipline. And
amateur theatricals.
Yes.
His performance as Pooh Bah in The Mikado is remembered by all who saw it.
Or as they said in the annual, Lord High Everything Else, which I thought was...
He was a leader. He was a natural leader.
Yeah, he was a natural leader, but he was also someone who was very much into rules. And he was also quite dashing, tall and good-looking. And, I remember saying in the book that, the debutantes of Ballarat must have been very disappointed when Big George went to the priesthood. But
his biographer, remember, assures us that he had no significant romances with women.
I wonder why.
David, let me let me go back to your book in writing about George Pell, very much on the conservative edge of the Catholic Church, and in fact he seemed to have a proclivity for preaching the sex rules of the Church. Tell us about that.
Rick, can I just say something about the Melbourne response before I do?
Yes.
To understand what happens in Australia, you have to understand something of the structure of the Church here. It has no structure. It doesn't exist. The Church is in legal terms, about as structured as one of your book groups. There are orders and there are dioceses and there are, very importantly, trust funds. And they all go back to Rome. They don't merge here. There's a bishops' conference, but it has not great authority here. And in Australia, in every state, the assets of the Church are held in trusts. And those trusts are essentially, or were essentially, inaccessible to the victims of child abuse. They dealt with property and not with priests. And this was a rule that Pell himself, when he became Archbishop of Sydney, spent millions of dollars on lawyers nailing down, so that you can't get to the money, or you couldn't. This was famously confirmed under Pell's direction in a case known as the Ellis case. And I was present in the Royal Commission the day that Pell was being questioned about the Ellis case and the brutal things they did to Ellis. They had admitted to Ellis that his abuse took place and then demanded he prove it in court. And there was just this wonderful moment when Gail Furness, counsel assisting the Royal Commission, turned to Pell, who was explaining that his lawyer's advice was to do this, his lawyer's advice was to do that. And she just said quietly, "Cardinal, were your lawyers your morals advisors?" It was the most devastating question I heard at the Royal Commission, and Pell was just...
The Royal Commission found that Pell did know what was going on in terms of the Ellis defence.
Yeah,
and
he pretended he just didn't know, wasn't across it.
he wasn't being told. He was being told, and there is plenty of proof to show that he was. But the thing that really got me about Ellis when I was researching and writing the book was, he was broke. He was very depressed. He was suicidal and heavily mortgaged. And the Catholic Church had this technical defence that, it had no legal personality and therefore it had won, in the highest court. But they were enforcing costs against this man.
They asked him for nearly $1 million in costs or something.
I think it was 750 from memory, but...
the brutality of it is unbelievable.
It's shocking, this rich institution, and it wasn't until Ellis's lawyer went to the Pell lawyers and said, basically, this guy's going to top himself. Stand down. And at that point, they finally caved. But the correspondence between them was discovered in the Royal Commission, and they talked about the Daily Telegraph test. Basically, how bad would it be if it were to come out, that this guy had
topped himself,
killed himself because of what they were doing. It is despicable.
Not the pub test, ladies and gentlemen, the Daily Telegraph test.
The tabloid in Sydney.
Once you understand that the victims couldn't get at the assets of the church, then you understand the power of arrangements like the Melbourne response and Towards Healing. That was the only, for most people, except for people like the Fosters, who, ladies and gentlemen, are the saints of this story. Remarkable, remarkable people. And so there was the Melbourne response offering people a maximum of $50,000. Now, my rough estimate, it's impossible, my rough estimate is that the Melbourne response saved the Melbourne Archdiocese $200 million. And when questioned about the meanness of the Melbourne response, Pell said, I had an obligation as Archbishop to take care of the resources of the Archdiocese. Now, what was your question, Rick?
Well, I was going to move away from that question. We can answer that maybe during the question time. I was going to come back to Louise, since she's picked up on this theme of suicides, and you write very passionately and very painfully about that experience of the people whom you addressed. I was hoping you might talk a bit about the role of the Victoria Police and Operation Plongère in relation to that.
So there was a cop in Ballarat, who's still a cop in Ballarat, who investigated this awful crisis that was going on in his town. And his name is Kevin Carson, and he is one of the best people that I have ever met. It actually makes me emotional thinking about Kevin Carson. He spent years scraping people out of baths, cutting people down from rafters, knocking on widows and mothers and sisters and doors and telling them what had happened. And these people were the people who had been victims of child sexual abuse in that town, principally at St. Alepius, the primary school that was pretty much ground zero for Christian Brothers abuse, and a place where George Pell was stationed famously with Gerald Ridsdale, one of the worst pedophiles in Australia of any kind, let alone clergy, and also at St. Patrick's College, which of course was George Pell's old school. Anyway, he started compiling this data because he thought that someone should look into this, the coroner or someone like that. And he had found 43 suicides that he could link to child sexual abuse, most of them in Ballarat, but a couple outside, like the Foster's daughter, for instance. And he tried to get sort of someone at Victoria Police to, to put this forth. Anyway, it ended up being leaked to the Age newspaper, and they had this big sort of front page and photographs of the people. And then Victoria Police, for reasons unknown, set about discrediting it. And they had this secret operation called Operation Plongere, which was basically looking into why the people suicided. And they found that only one person had actually suicided because of child abuse, and that was the foster's daughter. And this report was then leaked to The Australian, who put it on the front page, and poor Kevin Carson was completely discredited, and it was incredibly painful for him, but also for the families. But when I was doing my book, I started going around. I got the original reports that were unredacted, because there was a redacted version in the Royal Commission which had no names. I found the originals, and I went around and found the people involved. And I discovered that of all of the sort of witnesses who Kevin Carson had suggested that police speak to, none of them had actually been spoken to. Family members hadn't been contacted. Family members who had information, witnesses who could say, yeah, this is what happened. It was a complete whitewash, and it had been used by the Catholic Church in order to try and discredit this whole operation. And in one case, a guy called Peter Curran, who was a victim of a few people in Ballarat who died, he was in his lounge room for 2 days with stab wounds to his stomach. And when he finally went to hospital, he was a terrible alcoholic by this stage. His life had completely unravelled. He was one of the first people to come forward to talk about this issue in Ballarat. He told the police that someone had come to his door and stabbed him. And then his story kind of changed, but he was delirious by this point. He was dying. Anyway, the Operation Plongere report had his death as natural causes, which is just... He died of stab wounds. And there are lots of really, really devastating stories that I talk about in the book related to that. But this whole thing was used by the defenders of the church and the Pell sort of clique within the church, and people like Andrew Bolt and Gerard Henderson and the rest of them, to demonstrate that this child abuse thing was just, completely overstated.
Let me take another hot topic in this area. Both of you write on this rather contentious issue around pedophilia amongst the clergy, and of course it emerged once again in the Royal Commission. Louise, you write that you interviewed a lot of priests for this book, and that, quote, pretty much every priest I've spoken to believes that it's more likely that this vocation was seen as a safe haven for someone with paedophiliac tendencies, rather than the seminary being a place that created pedophiles. David, you write that a psychotherapist reported years ago that only half the Catholic clergy are celibate anyway. So let's talk about celibacy and pedophilia. Who wants to tackle that issue first?
Well, celibacy is a fraud. It's just a fraud. And it's been a fraud for 1,000 years. What we're talking about today did not start in 1972. This is a millennium-old fraud. Men have sex. And the magical power of a man able to put sex behind him is, in many primitive societies, proof of holiness. And it was that ancient, bizarre notion that the Catholic Church plugged into 1,000 years ago when it decided to enforce celibacy on its clergy. It's got nothing to do with inheritance laws. It's got nothing to do with any of that. It's a claim to magical authority. And of course, it is a fraud. Men fuck. They keep on fucking even after they have made all of these vows. They have sexual relationships with other men and with women and with children. The Church's authority depends on hiding this ordinary human fact. And the church has been extraordinarily adept for 1,000 years in hiding the fact that priests continue to have sexual relationships. And it is, firstly, an endless supply of children, and secondly, the knowledge that they will be protected by this institution that attracts pedophiles into the church. It is a safe haven with an endless supply of victims.
But it's also perfect for someone who wants to groom not just children, but also a community, their parents, their teachers, you know, the wider community, the laity, because they have this status of God's representatives on earth. Why would you question someone
Another Christ.
Yes. Why would you question someone like that? And it's the perfect place if you are someone who is that way inclined to hide. You have an excuse. You know, you don't have to pretend that you have a wife. And that was what was happening. And it was interesting talking to the former seminarians who had gone through with George Pell, because during that time there were a huge number of pedophiles that went through Corpus Christi in Melbourne. And they talked about the seminary culture and how cloistered and monastic and clericalist it was. And, you know, it was so strict. You know, they would sort of joke with me that, you know, the big lark was to short sheet someone's bed, you know, or to, you know, hitchhike to Geelong for a hamburger, like wacko.
Or grab their nuts under the shower.
Well... And they said it was a very unhealthy kind of place. And imagine, you know, it was they weren't allowed to have mixed tennis, you know, games.
You know where that leads? Mixed doubles, heterosexuality.
Yikes. But, you know, then these people get turned out the other side and they're supposed to lecture the rest of us on relationships and marriage and life. You know, I mean, it's absolutely insane.
Rick mentioned a wonderful and interesting man called Richard Sarre, who was a monk at one stage, ended up as a psychotherapist. And he's the one who is the source of the assessment, scientifically reached over many, many years, of 50% of clergy having sexual relationships. Now, let me make it clear, that's not a lifetime score. Sarre was saying at any one time, 50% of clergy are in sexual relationships. And he gave as a score for a lifetime of celibacy, he rather thought it was in the single figures for priests and religious. The whole thing is a fraud. But George Pell made his career in the church by preaching the glories of celibacy for the clergy and demanding sexual discipline from the laity. This is the church of John Paul II. Much of what we are talking about today and dealing with in the world now, it was a decision of John Paul II to restore the glory of the church. And that had a couple of aspects. One was the authority of the priest in the parish. One was that those priests would be resolutely protected by the church itself. And another was the demand that civil societies in the countries where the church operated would give way to the demands of the church. And John Paul II was very, very amenable to priests like Pell, who were very intelligent, natural leaders, good organisers, good managers, very comfortable at the big end of town, able with almost magical skill to get large sums of money both from parishioners and from governments. Pell has a body of talents which are indispensable in an organisation like the church. And he kept preaching. If you wanted a nasty quote about lesbians, or about IVF, or about contraception, and particularly about homosexuals, George Pell was your man. And he had a weekly column in the Murdoch newspapers, and he used that weekly column to put the boot into ordinary men, women who did not fit the sexual paradigm that he saw as the holy necessity of civil society. He made his career in the church by being an absolute turd. And that was the view of Catholics as well.
David, thank you for answering the question that I posed about 25 minutes ago. Yes, thank you for that. Louise.
Can I say, I think that there's something really important going back to the whole seminary thing, which is that, the Royal Commission found that these, traditional cloistered monastic clericalist places were forming priests in a way that was not conducive to avoiding child abuse. And they found that seminary formation in Australia was very ad hoc. It was different in different places, and then it needed to be more consistent. And one of the things that they were really strong on was that it had to be consistent they had to introduce the concept of child abuse. They couldn't just push it under the carpet, as has often been the church's want. Now, when George Pell was in the seminary, it was like that. And then it actually sort of liberalised in Melbourne in the 80s. And I spoke to a guy called Paul Connell, who was rector of the seminary when George Pell became Archbishop. And it had become quite progressive. And they'd also become very choosy about who they were actually bringing in, because they wanted people who were going to be good priests. They didn't want people who were, just any old person off the street. And George Pell, when he came in as Archbishop, allowed the entire seminary staff to resign. Pretty much threw them out, and went back to the older model. Now, the church in Australia is now grappling with this problem that a lot of people don't want to become priests, and they're having what when you talk to the older priests who've been around for a long time, 4, 5, 7 priests who are coming from the developing world, because that's pretty much the only place that they can get them. I mean, there are a few odd people who are not that they are odd, but the odd person here and there that's coming from Australia, but a lot of them are coming from overseas, and this is a real issue for the church.
Let me take you for the last few minutes before I promised us to have 20 minutes of questions to the burning question at the moment. Both of you have updated your books in relation to the events of the last 6 months, or however long it's been since the trial. Louise, I'll come back to you to finish before we take questions, and if you do want to have a question, you might want to start lining up now at the microphone. I know you're a witness in the trial. I might come back to that. But David, would you give us a quick overview of what happened in relation to the allegations, the trial, the appeal, and why we're going to be before the High Court next week?
Look, we could sit down comfortably, I think, at this point.
For another hour.
A 3-hour discussion on this. You all know the basics. He was found guilty by a jury of having forced his penis into the mouth of a choir boy, sexually assaulted another choir boy, and then grabbed the nuts while passing of one of the choir boys in a crowded corridor. He was found guilty of all of that. There are aspects of the trial that I think we need to consider very deeply, and one of them is that the trial was unreported while it went on, and that was because everybody expected, including the judiciary and prosecution, that would be a further trial after that for what were called the cathedral offences, and then there was to be a trial for what were called the swimming pool offences. George Pell's real MO, most familiar MO is romping with 8-year-old boys at swimming pools. You're up in the air and the hand just happens to slip into the Speedos once or twice or 3 times, 4 times, and there was to be a second trial. Because of the second trial, the first trial was not for the most part closed, but it was unreported. The second trial failed. We have a huge question to ask here. We should have been absolutely certain that that second trial was going to go ahead before the first trial was held unreported. And more important than that, I can understand why the law in Victoria, and now I think in every state, protects not only the identity but the evidence of the complainant of abuse. So, ladies and gentlemen, we all know a little bit about the witnesses who were brought by the church to say Pell couldn't have done it. Louise doesn't know, I don't know, nobody in this audience knows, unless they were on the jury or one of the lawyers, what the complainant actually said in his evidence. That is secret. It will never be known. And so next week, sorry, Louise.
Louise, I will cut David short there because I want to go to some questions. Give us a response to that and maybe some observations from your own experience.
Quickly on that first point that David's just been talking about, I think it's really problematic that the evidence of the complainant was in camera. Not so much that it was in camera, but that we can't see the transcript, redacted if need be for anything.
Identity purposes, so that we never know who he is.
Precisely. But I think it has played into the hands of those who would doubt him. And can I say, I know him, and he is a good person. And he has been gaslit uphill and down dale by people who don't know what they're talking about. And he lives with a mountain of pain every day. He was raped when he was 13 with his friend. His friend became a heroin addict the following year when he was 14. He was a heroin addict for the rest of his life. He never held down a full-time job. He died when he was 31, and I know his mum and his dad and his sister, and I speak to his mum quite a lot, and she has to live without her boy, and she has to live with these people who just keep gaslighting her son's friend and her family, and it's appalling. People need to stop being so insensitive about these people. That young man, the choir boy, went through it's 5 years. It's coming up for 5 years since he first went to Victoria Police. He has nothing to gain from this experience. He does not want infamy. He has not asked for compensation and has specifically ruled it out. He just wanted to tell the truth about who George Pell is. And George Pell is not a good person, in my humble opinion.
Perfection.
Okay, we have about 17 minutes of questions. Please keep them short so we can get through as many as possible. Gentlemen in the front, thank you.
Why do you think it is a seemingly reasonable Roman Catholic like Father Frank Brennan would suggest that Pell is being scapegoated?
Huge question. It rests upon his conscience.
Ask him.
We'll go to the next question. Thank you, sir.
Almost exactly a year ago, Frederick Martel published his book In the Closet of the Vatican, and he had interviewed 1,500 clergy in 20 countries. He found that about 40% were actively homosexual, another 40% were rather, shall we say, prone that way. He claimed that the paedophiles were protected.
Please, can we move to the question?
There is a paedophile protection going on, which was said here. He, Martel, claims that the Catholic Church is the largest gay club in the world, and that the mechanism by which the paedophiles are protected is because the upper echelons are afraid that the dirt will come out about them if they go to civil authorities. Would you agree with that?
What I would say about this, and there's a guy called James Miller who wrote a book about this, he's a survivor. He talks about the fact that the celibacy issue actually creates, it's like a mutually assured destruction, because the priest who's having the lovely caravan holidays with his housekeeper who he's in love with, well, the pedophile's got dirt on him. And the priest who's having a very nice consensual gay relationship with another priest or brother or something, well, the pedophile's got dirt on him. And it creates this environment of secrecy and cover-up, and I think that's a problem.
Next question, please.
What the various inquiries around the world have shown, I think, beyond doubt, is that we have a systemic problem within the Catholic Church in terms of these issues. And a very characteristic, the Empire Fights Back, an attempt to repress the allegations coming forward. Ellis tells us a lot about that. What sort of response have you had as journalists by the Catholic Church to your attempts to publish and to reveal?
Depends who you're talking about. I mean, from the Gerard Hendersons of this world, you are an anti-Catholic bigot. The ABC is an anti-Catholic organisation. Remember, he described Louise's superb St Kevin's story as a pile-on, and because what he wanted to do was once again put his boot into the ABC and once again protect the Catholic Church.
Empathy and child protection be damned.
Yeah, the kid, the victim at the centre of it, he doesn't matter, because, what matters here is attacking the ABC, protecting the church. Look, there's a lot of ugly stuff said about the journalists. I don't give a damn, frankly. I just don't give a damn.
And can I say that those people like him and Bolt and so on, they have loud voices, but I've heard from thousands of people since my book was first published, back in May 2017, from all around Australia, and I would say that 99% of the feedback that I've had is overwhelmingly positive, and the zeitgeist has moved on, and these people who are desperately clinging on to this stuff are yesterday's men.
Thank you for that question.
My question kind of follows on from the last one. While I can understand Catholics in the church defending Pell, because it's feet of clay type thing, why do so many in the media, like Bolt and Henderson and the rest of them, when they've not gone to the court case like you did, they've not studied it, but they are so vehement in their defences of Pell and the church? You
have to understand that Pell is a hero of the most tedious war in history, the culture wars. Pell is a hero in the culture wars, because the culture wars are also about vigorous sex rules by which society ought to live. The culture wars are anti-gay. The culture wars are anti-women. The culture wars are anti-lesbians wanting IVF. He was somebody who was brave enough to put his name to the most appalling statements about other human beings. I mean, he made a career out of it, as I said. He's a culture war hero. And he is more of a hero outside the church to those culture warriors than he is inside the church. It's a very peculiar situation, but you do have to understand the culture wars, the way they're fought through the Murdoch newspapers and from other sources as well. It's not just the Murdoch press, but that really matters. George Pell is a hero of, and currently a martyr of, the culture wars.
I think there's also an element of legacy protection as well. These people have aligned themselves with him. And I think also on a more human level, it's very hard to think that the person that you socialised with, that you partied with, that you went into battle in the culture wars with, that person could rape children. That's a really, really difficult thing to come to terms with. And I think any of us would feel that way if it was our friend. But the point is, in our heart, it would be hard to come to that. But the point is, when it comes to child protection, the children have to be first.
But one more thing as well. If an archbishop is forcing his penis into the mouth of a choir boy...
Don't say it again.
None of the church's teaching works. The whole thing is a flop.
The house of cards falls down.
The house of cards, at that point, it's just nonsense. And that's really hard to face.
Let's take the next question. Thank you.
A friend of mine is the mother of a policeman who has been dealing with this matter, and he told her that there is a file on George Pell that was that thick, 3 inches thick. I just wanted to ask you if you knew when that file would start to come out.
Watch this space.
I can actually assure you there is a new book from Louise coming out sometime.
It's not about that.
No, oh, well, I'd buy it anyway, I'm sure.
Yeah, but buy it.
Next question, please.
Louise, how did you gain the trust of the people that were accusing George Pell?
I think those people had got to the point where they just wanted to tell their truth, you know. They'd had enough and they'd been waiting for a long time for the police to make a decision about charging. And some of them thought that he would never come back from Rome, that he would be protected by the Vatican. But also, you know, I just always try and treat people with kindness and empathy. Now, that doesn't mean that I just accept everything. I believe them, you know, but I have to then go and fact check everything that they say and subject it to the forensic glare of investigative journalism. That's what we have to do. But, you know, just listening to people and being kind to people goes a long way in journalism, I find. And those people stay loyal to you for years and years afterwards.
Next question, please.
Thank you. Very rightly, child protection has to be the priority. But I also wanted to ask about the abuse of others in the church, particularly the sexual abuse of vulnerable adults, and how these people might be given a voice.
Louise?
Well, it's tricky because they didn't have a Royal Commission, so it's, you know, there has been a bit that has come out about this issue recently, particularly in regards to nuns who were sexually assaulted by priests and so on. But yeah, I do think it is a big sort of issue, but it's not one that I have really spent a lot of time on, I have to say.
No, me neither. I mean, it emerges here and there, but the various ways in which priestly authority can be used to abuse people is pretty much endless.
Next question, please.
David, my first question is for you. When you signed my book on Pell a couple of years ago, you asked me what do I think should happen to him, and I've since thought of something. What about castration before ordination? And
I might take that as a comment. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Why are those funds called trust funds? Why shouldn't they be called mistrust funds?
It's just an ancient mistake of the law that can't now be corrected. Yes.
Another one, sorry.
I might go to the end of the line. We might see how we go. We've got 7 minutes to go. So
and we've got a big queue behind
and we've got another 4 people to go. Just pop back there. We've never done that before, recycled questioners. But we'll try that this morning for the first time. Yes, sir, thank you.
My question is for both David and Louise, and that is, how prepared are both of you for the possibility of the High Court acquitting Pell?
Thank you. That was going to be my last question today. Thank you, sir. Yes.
There is a high likelihood that Pell will be acquitted next week. And if that happens, he will be immediately released next week. Lawyers do not like this decision. They
don't trust juries.
They don't trust juries. And you can go online and read the very, very learned arguments of Pell's defence team. He has very fine lawyers defending him, and you can read there a beautiful intellectual analysis of where they think the jury went wrong and the Court of Appeal in Victoria went wrong. But it boils down to something very, very simple, and that is, what weight do you give to the team of witnesses, 20 of them, assembled by the church, to say that it was essentially impossible at that time in that room for Pell to have assaulted children. Now, the jury looked at those witnesses and put their evidence aside and believed the complainant. No one is questioning how convincing the complainant is. It's very, very interesting. Pell's lawyers aren't saying he's unconvincing. Pell's lawyers
He's
are saying...
totally convincing, believe me.
Pell's lawyers are saying he is convincing. But Pell's lawyers are saying, but on the other hand, there are all of these witnesses who said it couldn't happen. Now, whatever happens next week, there is going to be an uproar of one kind or another. Justice is not done in this country because of the uproar that will follow. Justice is done in this country because we seek justice between Pell and his accuser. And we will all deal as a community with whatever outcome occurs. But what matters here is justice. And this is a verdict that many lawyers find is not sufficiently backed by evidence, and other lawyers find is absolutely backed by evidence. And those are the lawyers who also say the primary deciders of fact in our judicial system are juries, and a jury outcome is not lightly overturned, but we will see.
One point, those people who came forward to give evidence, and I'm going to be very careful here. As mentioned earlier, I did a story about St Kevin's College last week. Oh no, it wasn't last week, it's about 3 weeks.
Month.
3 weeks ago now. It's all... as a result of that story, a number of teachers have been let go. And as a result of that story, a number of complaints have been made to Victoria's Commissioner for Children and Young People. Those complaints have been forwarded by the school and also in relation to one person by another school. And the Commissioner for Children and Young People has forwarded those to Victoria Police. One of those people was a witness in the Pell case, and that person was one of the people upon whom the defence rely for their impossibility defence.
A witness for the prosecution. Yes.
He was a witness for the prosecution, but in turn the defence rely upon his evidence to say that this couldn't have happened. Just one other point on those verdicts. On those judgments by the Court of Appeal, in which the majority upheld the jury's decision. The dissenting judgment by Justice Weinberg, who is a very learned criminal lawyer, one of the things that really stood out for me was he is very sceptical about the second offence. So there's the first offence, which is in the sacristy, the two boys are sexually assaulted by Pell. The second one is Pell grabs the genitals of the now surviving choir boy, and it's a crowded corridor.
En passant.
And Justice Weinberg says that this was implausibly brazen. He just cannot believe that this could have happened in a crowded corridor. Two things about that. Grabbing testicles and, genitals is what so many people have alleged to me, to Victoria Police and to the Southwell inquiry back in 2002, an internal church inquiry about a complaint of this nature against George Pell. That's what they all said that George did. That's George's MO, according to all these people. Secondly, grabbing genitals in public. I would throw it open to the women here. First time it happened to me, I was 14 years old and I was in a crowded pavilion, not unlike this one, and a much older gentleman put his hand up my skirt and grabbed. And I turned to everyone around me and no one, and loudly protested that he had done this, and no one did anything. After that, it happened to me in nightclubs, it happened to me on the street, it happened outside my apartment. Again and again and again, men do these things. And I've spoken to a lot of my girlfriends about this, and they all say they had the same thing happen. It wouldn't be surprising that a man who is attracted to young boys would take the same sort of risk.
Let me go. Thank you, Louise. Let me go to the questioner at the microphone. We've got about 2 minutes. If it's a short question and a short answer, we can get to the last question. We're not going to get to the recycled question. I'm sorry.
This is even shorter. Raping children seems to me has nothing to do with loving them. So why do we call it paedophilia? Do we need another term to describe these monstrous things that happen to children?
Probably we can work on the word.
Yes. And we'll take this the last question, sir. Thank you very much.
It's really clear that priests and people that are so-called the lovers of God and the representatives of God do terrible things. But there are many people who love God that do wonderful things, and good news stories seem to be really important to counterbalance this terrible bad news story. Could you make a comment on that?
I think that for the many Catholics, I mean, that's my research has been into the Catholic Church, you know, a lot of them are crying out for some good news stories to be heard. But the point is, just because there are good news stories doesn't mean that the bad news, which is terribly, terribly, terribly bad, shouldn't be heard over and over again until there is change and until there is justice. And I have to say that my story about St Kevin's the other week shows that despite the Royal Commission, exactly the same culture of cover-up and denial was existing at that place right now.
So, thank you for that question, because I think it beautifully prompted Louise to summarise this entire session. Would you once again thank David and Louise for their contribution?